Welcome to this webinar. I'm going to start with some intros, then explain what we're going to be talking about. And throughout, please do use the chat for questions, thoughts, even like networking. We're here for all of it. But let me jump right in by introducing the panel. So I'm joined by Colin Slade, who is the VP of People at Cloudbeds. He is an Athena customer, so I'm super jazzed to have him. And then in addition to his people experience, he actually sort of came up through the CS world. And so like an interesting perspective of sort of being in a different part of the business before transitioning to people. And we were debating fun fact versus show book that we were watching. And I think we've landed on Colin has a really fun fact and therefore ought to share it.
Thank you, Roxanne. Yeah, super excited to be here, everyone. I'm excited to talk about hotlines. We've had pretty awesome experience ourselves, and so excited to talk about it. My fun fact is that I, quite a few years ago, was able to race ostriches in South Africa because my dad is South African. So I don't think many of you can put that on your resume, so good luck.
And I think the key part is it's not that you were like watching two ostriches race. You were like, on an ostrich, right?
I was on the ostrich. I will say I did not win because there were smaller people on the ostriches that would go faster.
Still wild. Okay, and then also joined by Ashley Hurd. She is the founder of Manager Method um, and is an HR bestie, and then actually has legal experience before kind of transitioning into the people world. Obviously, a really great perspective to have, given hotlines, employee relations issues often kind of span people and legal. She has really great LinkedIn content, so I would strongly advise you to follow her if you don't already. Ashley, what either fun fact and or book, movie, TV show do you have?
Well, my Venn diagram, and thank you, everybody. Thanks, Roxanne, Colin. Thanks for everybody for being here today. And my Venn diagram kind of straddles the two in that my fun fact is that I was recently on a show called Scare Tactics. This was a show that had been on for years, but Jordan Peele just rebooted it. And
Wow.
it's a horror themed prank show. I am not a horror person, but I did prank my best friend from law school. So that was on a few weeks ago, but I've been watching it on Friday nights on the USA Network. It's a very funny, like great palate cleanser for the end of the week.
My great fear in life is to be punked at some point. So please don't.
It is, as I just say, it's a problem now. No, I had to really think about who I would pick, and I very specifically picked, and Megan was the perfect person. So we're
um,
we're still good friends, thankfully.
that's the key is to emerge still speaking. So love that. Okay, and then I'm Roxanne Petraeus. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Ethena. Before that, I was in the army, and so kind of have a very different maybe experience from corporate world, but have definitely sort of interacted with various tools for essentially building a speak up culture, and then now get to work with really incredible customers like Colin, like other really innovative companies in rolling out either compliance training or HR investigations tools, which Athena has. For a little bit of context on this webinar, in addition to using the chat, we'll do some pulse questions, kind of just like yes, no, scale of 1 to 5 type stuff. And really encourage you, if you're comfortable, to put your answers in the chat. It just gives us a sense of sort of like who you are, what issues you're interested in. And then if you just put an asterisk next to your name if you don't want to be called on for anything, that is totally fine and works great. And then the last disclaimer is that this isn't legal advice, and so just make sure that you're always consulting counsel if you have any legal advice, because this is not the place to get it, though it is the place to get fun facts and tool recommendations. Okay, cool. So let's jump right in with what we're going to be talking about. We're talking about choosing a hotline, introducing it, teaching our managers about their role with it. And then I think most crucially, so I'll make sure we have time here, building trust once reports essentially start to trickle in. I think the panelists had some like really good perspectives on that. Would love to start with a question to kick off the sort of like selecting a hotline part. Simple yes or no question. Yes or no, I have rolled out a hotline before. I will literally participate. I am a no. I've seen many hotlines get rolled out before. I know Ashley has rolled out a hotline before. I know Colin has rolled out a hotline before. All right, let me see what we've got. We've got a lot of nopes. And you know what? We can keep this small. These topics are kind of sensitive. I won't call on folks. let's just make that. I think Melanie does a phenomenal job at it, but I'll keep it very chill. Okay, what's really helpful to see is we have a lot of no's, which is great because we'll try to tailor this toward sort of like my first hotline kind of discussions versus like, hey, I'm thinking of maybe transitioning off of hotlines or anything like that, because it looks like the majority of you have not, which is actually perfect because that's kind of a lot of what we're going to be talking about. First, let me pause. Ashley, Colin, anything to add on that? And otherwise, I can start calling on you for these sorts of things.
No, I appreciate level setting. I mean, I think it's important and to talk through like just high levels of it.
Totally, especially because it's an intimidating tool to roll out.
Yeah, and I think, I
Colin?
mean, you're going to talk about it right now. So I think, you know, there's a lot of scenarios where it's necessary to roll out, and there's a lot of scenarios where maybe you should for not necessarily required reasons, but to make sure your teams and company feel like they have a place to go.
Love that. And maybe let's like actually jump right into like why someone who's a no might, you know, sort of like become a yes. And then we also wanted to spend some time on how they can become a yes. Something I hear really frequently from people leaders is, hey, I want this tool, but my leadership super doesn't want this tool. I've listed some of the regulations and legal stuff here. We can send out afterwards as resources, sort of like what are all of these acronyms and alphabet soup type of things, which might help you make a business case for a hotline. But I won't go into details here because I feel like that's not really the meaty stuff. Ashley and Colin, would love to turn it over to you to talk about like what tells you that a company might be ready or benefit from a hotline.
Ashley, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point is sometimes you really have to have one. When I first was, so as background, I was a law firm lawyer, and then I went in-house. I worked directly as a lawyer for companies, both public companies, private companies, you know, smaller now. And now as I do things, I've seen handbook. I mean, I've seen hotlines from a variety of sources. And so I was first really exposed from like the have to. And again, like, so always good to check with your counsel, like, do we have to have one? You probably know. But the lane that I imagine a lot and here are that have either rolled it out or thinking of it are, you know, why do we need that? And the best organization, I'd say, doesn't need an anonymous or other hotline because you have a place where people feel like they can speak up. But I think a lot of times, even at the leadership level, there's this sense like, well, if something was going on, someone would tell me. And I think back to that. I wish I had the name of it, but that study of like New York where Roxanne is, but like, you know, the person in the street screaming from help and all.
Oh, Kitty Genevieve's, yeah, the like
This is why
collective action.
This is why you make friends with smart people. So trivia night, Roxanne and Colin are my team. Anybody else?
Not if it's sports. Not if it's sports. Yeah.
Put your knowledge in the chat. But this aspect of like everyone heard, so nobody did anything. And so at the leadership level, I think there's two aspects of that. You have these managers that know something's happening, but they don't know what to do. They're afraid for their own job. And then you have leaders that think, well, this isn't really how it's happening, or they're not hearing the message altogether because they're so far removed. And so I think there's the really important piece is a recognition that there are a lot of thoughts, concerns that live within the brains of your organization, maybe on social media, maybe they're telling their friends. And so this aspect of numbers 2 and 3 on the left side of culture, and then how do you convince leadership that there is this channel that should be a last resort, but that may be exactly the only resort that people feel comfortable with.
Colin, I would love to hear like, yeah, how you've seen people or how you personally have kind of like convinced leadership, like, hey, I think it's really time.
Yeah, so I mean, I think to Ashley's points, I think the big piece for us is that we want as many places for people to give feedback as possible, right? So, and we already had a lot. So our teams do a really great job of having a safe place for people to, whether it's, we use Workday Peakon for like sort of anonymous ongoing surveys. We have, you know, we have Glassdoor, we have stay interviews, we have exit interviews, we have, you know, obviously open door policy across the organization. But I think a big piece that convinced leadership was two things. One, as you move internationally and as you move into areas where you need SOC 2 compliance, or you have to, for example, we had a couple entities in Europe, and they have recently come up with some really strong EU whistleblower type of legislation. And so
Yeah.
for us personally, the reason we started to really push into this was because we had entities that were requiring us to have a solution, right? So, and it was like, well, we already have this, right? Leadership is kind of like, why do we need this? So part of it was a requirement, but a part of it also was there are still misuses of all the internal tools that you have. So having a third party that is totally sort of separated from whatever the view is of HR, whatever the view is of the company, or whatever the view is of leadership. Although I totally agree with Ashley, it would be incredible that if your company, just everyone felt comfortable totally speaking up. That is not normally the average, right? The normal is that there are pockets of toxicity and there are pockets of really good leadership. And so this allows you to have a tool to kind of do it. So we were a little bit of both in the sense that
Yep.
we were kind of forced into it, but we decided to do it globally. We were not required to do it globally, but we thought it would be a really great place for people to be able to raise their hand and, you know, say things that weren't necessarily something they know whether they should go to HR. It wasn't necessarily something they would put on their pecan, which you can track a little bit, right? This would be a completely sort of separated away from the, let's call it leadership structure. And so we went with Ethena and whistleblower. We call it the whistleblower program, and it's been awesome.
I love that. So kind of like what I'm hearing from both of you is if you have a we gots to, that's always very powerful for convincing leadership because you can just like point to like it's not me, it's the EU, you know, or something. So that's great. But then maybe combine with that, sort of making the case to leadership that the company wasn't maybe what it was when it was first founded. Like I myself am a founder, and Ashley, I totally hear you that you can kind of get a little bit of a feeling of like, not at my company, right? Like everybody is always telling me, the CEO, the exact truth 100% of the time. I think that can just be like a leadership trap that a lot of us fall into, but sort of giving, helping convince leaders that like, hey, at a certain scale, like there's just no way statistically that's true. Let me pause to see if I got that right. Like anything else to add on
Yeah.
that?
I think that was fair. And I think in some Q&A, I saw like one question bleeds into that, which is
Yeah.
how do you convince leadership at a smaller organization? And I think some of
Yeah.
it is a very similar script. I always like to meet people where they are. And yes, like my life as a lawyer, there's a reason I'm no longer a lawyer and living that life of being the perpetual situational janitor, cleaning everything up after the fact, but hopefully doing other things. But going into HR, I had to really recognize, you know, your voice. It's a lot easier as a lawyer to say like, oh, well, you know, these are the fines. It's harder to build that case, but it's really important. There's a lot of great research in Harvard Business Review, HBR magazine, like no like affiliation, but it's one of the best ways I spend $120 a year because you get data and going online for articles. So sometimes if your leadership listens to data, that can be a great one to show this is why. If you're in a small organization and you're laughing at the idea of your CEO caring what Harvard Business Review says, because that's maybe the real reality for some, I always think meet people where you are. And so if you're in a small organization, saying to leadership, you were small, and so you would like to think everyone says anything. But on the flip side, if you're an employee and you have these relationships, that may make you even more afraid to say something. And if you're in a large organization, the flip of that. Well, if you're in a large organization, you may think we're so big, my voice doesn't count for anything. So I think thinking of where you are, you can kind of use that to influence leadership best you can.
I love the
And
call out to, oh, please,
I
Colin, go
was going
ahead.
to add to that. I think I totally agree with everything there. I also would say that another thing from a leadership standpoint is a lot of times in companies, there isn't a place for you to get the information you need to protect yourself from a legal standpoint. So like
Mm.
this is one way to talk to leadership is to sort of say like, we don't know if there are things happening. And if we have this, now we will know and we can prevent it or do something about it versus having a scandal later when a manager who didn't say anything was told something or there was things happening that no one knew where to say it. And so I also think that it's a little bit more of a fear talk tactic, right?
Yeah.
But there is protection there that you had a process and you followed it and you did everything you were supposed to in case something does come up later. And leadership generally is trying to prevent those things long down the line.
I was going to say something very similar. I talked to a people leader at a smaller company who had rolled out our hotline, and I was like kind of asking like how did you get buy-in? And she said some version. I think she did it much more tactfully, but of kind of saying to leadership, like, if I'm wrong, we're out a couple $1,000, but if you're wrong, we might have just like avoided a very expensive, costly issue in which we'd have to end up getting a hotline anyway, because usually as some sort of remediation for an employee relations issue, like someone is going to come in and tell you you need this. And I thought that was very clever, that like this is almost, if a leader doesn't think this is required, it's essentially just insurance. It's there in case we need it, and fingers crossed we never need it. I thought that was clever.
Agree.
I'd love for you all to talk a little bit about, and please folks put into the chat if there's like particular areas you'd love for Ashley and Colin to dig in on, what you look for with the employee experience, and then like kind of the admin and finally CS experience. Starting with the employee experience, Colin, because you rolled out Athena, would love to hear like what you found, what were you looking for in terms of like, I hope this tool does this, I want to see it do that. What I might just do while you're kind of explaining it is I'll just show our employee facing part of it. Can you all see this part of the screen? I'm terrible at screen share, as we have discussed.
Yes. Yeah, we can see it. Yeah,
Wonderful.
I think, for us, so we were already using Athena for our compliance training. So
Yep.
definitely advantage is that our teams are used to seeing the Athena, the branding, the forms, the sort of the platform, let's call it. And so
Yeah.
we did want it to be super easy, super simple. You could do it on mobile, you could do it anywhere. We also wanted it to be pretty easy to sort of like be given some suggestions and kind of like help direct them a little bit through it, because
Yep.
one thing we have found is that people aren't always sure what they should, and we'll talk about this later, but what they should report. And so I think simplicity, ease of use, and then also we wanted to be really clear the security piece, right? If someone's going to come forward, we want them to know that this is not going to go to their manager, right? This is going to
Yep.
go to a specific person who's going to investigate it. Could be HR, it could be someone
Yep.
else potentially. But yeah, that was really important for us. And so it kind of all just made sense. And like I said, we were really only required to do it for like 1 or 2 regions in Europe, but we just rolled it out globally and started kind of training everyone on it.
I love that. And one other thing I hear really important to building trust is the ability to opt into a like anonymous bi-directional communication, meaning I as an employee can stay anonymous, but if you, Colin, need to ask me questions about like my particular report, you can do it. And I've heard that that's like a particular feature that people care a lot about.
Yeah. Did you like that?
Ashley, anything you want to share on maybe like employee experience, any things you look for or have seen be very effective?
I'll blend it, like I'll kind of transition us from employee, and I know we're touching on the HR
Please. Yeah.
I love having the employee experience first. And why I say that is that often when these are rolled out, they're coming from HR. And so depending on whether you're an HR team of one, you're an HR team of many, oftentimes you're thinking about things of like, well, we need the data. We need to be able to sort and report this because I'm going to need to report this out to somebody else.
Yeah.
And that's true. But if you think of it from that user experience, from the employee that's going in, their hand may be shaking. The mental emotional point when someone is going to make a concern, the vast majority of the time it's very fearful, especially in the United States. Not as much. Sometimes the rest of the world, people understand their rights, they understand it, but in the US in particular, this is someone's last resort. And so making it as easy as possible to get that information. And I know we have questions we'll talk about, like, what about the fluff that comes in, or people are like retaliating? I mean, I have stood these up in the law firm environment. I have stood these up internally, and really the things that tend to come through are not the things that you're afraid of. Often it's someone wanting to tell their story, but I like it from that perspective of like keeping it simple and giving them information, because you as HR may know what's happening. And I'm on the HR Besties podcast. We had an episode like 3 weeks ago called Investigations 101, where we talk about more things and like calling it a concern, not necessarily a complaint. And thinking about these things, but is, this aspect of making it easy, but also the questions. Like, people are going to fill this out, think, is this going to go to the police? Is this going to, they literally don't know. And so if thinking about everything as if you strip away your HR or other knowledge and put yourself in the position of that employee, and maybe even involving some employees in this process of putting it together can be really helpful. Because I think on the flip side of that, as you think about the HR and admin, you may have to do a little bit of work on the back end if you're reporting it to your board or whatever, but like making it easy for employees and then taking that action and training anyone that's going to touch that data so they know how to code it. It's worth it to put a slight more burden on the HR team. And I say that having lived in that world, it's better because then you're going to get the information more. Like I love these FAQs are so
Yeah. I think that's totally right. We often hear that like people are going to be coming to this forum long before they report, right? Because they have some questions. And you can imagine from an employee perspective, if Ashley, you were my HRBP or something, I would never go to you and be like, Ashley, just like quick hypothetical question, how do I report an issue? You know, like it's like you're basically reporting that you have to out yourself. Like that's a really big like leap that you're expecting an employee to make. So I think kind of having the information almost be like evergreen on demand can be a really nice way where people can go and access it without basically saying like, I'm about to drop a bomb, but I just need a
Right.
couple of
Right.
quick logistical like
And one
details.
thing, if you scroll down a little bit on that screen, one
Yeah.
thing I liked that was like, who's going to know, basically, who's going to know? Like who's
Yeah. Yeah.
one thing is to
Yep.
be really intentional about what individuals, because like this is helpful as an example, but you may look at this and be like, oh God, this is a lot of people. This is gonna, okay. So think about controlling it. You can't
Totally.
be mindful of your workload, and especially like if you can't be going on a week-long, 2-week-long vacation, or maybe longer for any global attendees. But you can't like you can't make it just yourself. It's probably not. But thinking about threading the needle to have enough people, but not too many that's going to overwhelm. And so I like this information a lot.
Exactly. And then a feature we have that we've heard is very important for the employee experience is actually the ability to block certain admins from receiving a report, right? So if you're particularly concerned that Akila might see your report, I, as an employee, can essentially block her from that. And it's just like one more layer of like comfort. If, of course, you're reporting a particular individual, it's really uncomfortable to know that this report is going to land directly in their inbox, even though, of course, in the course of an investigation, they may need to be notified. We talked a lot about the employee experience. Would love to hear you all talk a bit about like what you think is really important from sort of an admin, user, HRBP, because there might be multiple users, right? Like you might be the sort of super user, but then there's a couple other folks. What are the things you you care about and look for?
Colin, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty simple on this one. I mean, we need an easy way to come in and get all the details and the information, right? We need an easy way to share some of the trends or some of the things, and we'll talk about it in a second, but like, not all cases or reports are legitimate, right? Or even necessarily like appropriate for this, but maybe they didn't go through the training, or maybe they don't understand, or maybe they feel like they have nowhere else to go. So we want it, and we don't not want them to send it. But sometimes, you are investigating. So I think a big piece is follow-up, right? You want to make it easy to show leadership in some capacity. You generally aren't going to be able to share individual reports, but trends and things like that. And then also just if there is anything really egregious, like to be notified immediately, right? Like it needs to come up to the top of the inbox so that we can deal with it ASAP, which is great. We get notified by email. So I think notifications and sort of the ability to kind of complete the investigation and look into it and then share some of the key points and be able to filter and stuff like that. We're about 700 and ish people or so. And so like, it's not unmanageable, but if you were a 20,000 person company, like you would need a way to filter and report and take it, like a lot more eyeballs and a lot more things to just have to sort through.
Exactly. Ashley, anything to add on the admin side?
I mean, I think it's just thinking, and I think we'll get more into this, but is this aspect of training? Like there's probably 5 different populations you need to really think about in the communication. And I know one of the things that's helpful with the Ethena team is a lot of like templates and things like that to make your life easier. But like when I worked with an organization rolling out a hotline, we worked with different provider. We customized it like nothing else. I think they probably hated us at that point. But it was a lot thinking about all sides, but really thinking about like how are you training your senior leaders about this? Like, and some of that's the bottom, but even after, like, how does this work? What about your managers? What are people that, it's kind of like this adage I say of like, nobody wants to go to a meeting until they're not invited to the meeting. And like, then they're like, wait, what happened? Like, why am I not? So it's the same thing when you have a hotline, there's this FOMO of information. And so proactively educating this, like why you're going to know some things you're not. And so, thinking about, in what you can, what you can customize. So taking templates, customizing those, making your life easy, but really thinking about the different populations that you need to proactively talk to, and the friendly, responsive people. Like, and we'll talk in the kind of of making sure that the team that you're working with or the vendor
Yeah.
is responsive to you as well.
Yeah, I feel like one of you brought this up to me, like the importance of making sure that your vendor can provide you with some best practices. I just pulled this like straight from our customer support like launch sort of deck of like so we try to give any of our new customers information on settings, sort of what to do, a checklist, and then even videos that they can send to their HRBPs and employees on like how this thing works, just so that no one is sort of set feels like they need to create everything from scratch, because that's like incredibly overwhelming. We Athena see hundreds of companies roll this out, so there's no reason why you should feel like you're the first one doing it.
And that was
Oh,
super helpful. Like
please.
we really didn't, it was a legal law we didn't really know about until like last minute. We just missed those. And so like,
Yep.
I think we rolled out the hotline in like a week. And
Love
so
that.
we
Yeah.
used a lot of the the scenarios and the templates and the information to sort of like get us way down the line, which if we had tried to do it all by ourselves, that would have been a lot harder. Because normally you would plan for this and have plenty more time, but there was a date we had to hit for, this was specifically in Spain, we needed to hit for Spain, and so we wanted to make sure that we got something within the deadline.
You're not the first nor the last person who has needed to launch in comical amounts of time. It's very common. So glad to hear it was smooth. Okay, so maybe we'll transition to like, all right, you've picked a hotline, you're feeling pretty good about it, and then let's like talk about kind of introducing it, because I think that gets into like the fear scenario. So I won't call on anybody blanket thing, but sort of 1 to 5, 1 being terrified, 5 being thrilled. How happy do you think a leadership team would be to see a hotline rolled out for the first time? Suddenly, they get notified at all hands or whatever, like, hey, guess what? Acme Corp will now have an employee hotline where information can be put through. I will seed it by saying that I have generally heard of leadership being somewhere between terrified and very frustrated that there will be an anonymous way to report feedback. I think a really common CEO founder perspective can kind of be I never know what the kids are saying, but I've heard like say it with your chest or something as a expression of like people, CEOs want to hear like, hey, Ashley, if you got feedback, like I'll put your name to it, otherwise I don't want to hear it. And of course a hotline can be like the exact opposite of that. Ashley, Colin, kind of like curious, what have you kind of seen as like a general, call it like leadership receptivity toward hotlines?
I see two totally. I see more on the terrified or the thrilled, and I guess the terrified could also be
Yeah.
with a slash of like annoyed or frustrated. I think that um, at Cloudbeds, our founders have literally like a founders hotline already, where like you can ping them at any point anonymously to just
Oh,
get
that's pretty cool.
feedback. So they're very much more on the like open door policy, like all the tools we have. There's never been any like resistance in any way. But I have heard some stories from some friends recently of sort of basically literally banning any type of feedback anonymously unless
Yeah.
it was told one-to-one, because those leaders are frustrated or terrified of receiving that, or they just don't want to listen. So right, so they don't want to hear it, and so they'd rather just, hey, if you can't tell it to my face, then it's not real, which
Yeah.
just means that you've basically taken away 90% of the population who will actually challenge a COO or a CEO in a meeting or in a one-on-one environment.
I think that like segues perfectly into fear. So let's just kind of start talking about them. I think Ashley, at some point earlier, you mentioned this of like, call it petty complaints, call it, thanks, Audrey. Call it like lifestyle complaints. I feel like someone referenced like the kombucha flavors changed, or, it's like in that bucket of kind of like, this doesn't really raise to the level of, I think, what the hotline might be intended for. Ashley, have you heard this fear articulated? How do you kind of work with HR leaders to overcome it?
Yeah, and I know we had like one Q&A on this. So same, like, how do you differentiate between like what needs to be reported and gossip? And like,
Yeah.
I think it is this fear of like minor things, gossip, like personal things about your executives and this. And I say it's, especially when you open the hotline, like anything, you're likely to get the most feedback. It generally is far less than you think. Like I've know at some organizations, they're like, we'll have 10 people at the ready, as if it's like, like, I don't know,
Yeah.
gladiator. And really I say it's, yeah, like you're probably going to get more at the beginning, but just knowing if someone is giving you that feedback, yes, in a very small amount of time, just like real life complaints, it's like people's frustrations and pointing to each other. But just knowing you're not likely to get as many as you think, and it's better to have channels and people give information that you're like, that's silly. Why wouldn't they do? Yeah, why wouldn't they tell Bob to stop making popcorn for 3 minutes and do it for 2.5? And you know what? Because the power dynamics in the workplace are such that people are just have a fear of feedback. Like employees have a fear of giving feedback, and then leaders often have a fear of getting that feedback. And sometimes it is that just natural ego. And so I think, those concerns don't happen. But I think having that mapping out of like, okay, when you get that, so what are we going to do with that? How are we going to plan that and communicate back to that person or communicate to the person at issue, and just knowing you may get those at the beginning, but they're probably going to be less than you think.
Yeah.
I think that's on that fear.
And then how about maybe on the flip side of, I think I see where you're going with it, of like, a lot of these people, probably small companies, are going to be the first hotline. They might be the only HR person who's receiving them, right? Like it might not be a, team of the 10, ready to fight. How do you kind of coach maybe like a solo HR person into feeling like, am I going to need to investigate literally everything that comes, through this channel?
Yeah. That's an incredibly hard one, because in HR, you have so many hats already. It's hard to add another hat on top of that, because they're likely already getting complaints coming to them from other realms. And so I think some of it is like, wait and see. And so I think in talking to leadership in particular, it's, I'll start it out. If for some reason there's a volume of things we're getting that are, if they're minor things, we can deal with that and probably, handle those and all of that. But if we're getting ones that really need, investigation, review, we got to think about resources, because if that's coming through, then there's a pretty good, chance. And I think this is where, to Colin's point, if sometimes you have to use we'd much rather deal with it at the outset and have, a second person or, a part-time resource that helps us, that focuses on this, then all of a sudden, okay, well, we're not going to do this all together, and then end up in litigation or end up getting an anonymous complaint over to the, EEOC or DOL or equivalents globally. And so I think really trying to recognize this, that again, it's probably not going to be the volume, but also recognizing how, as an HR person, you address these types of concerns matters greatly. And while it can be very hard when you have a full plate, knowing that just like it's important to have a friendly vendor when you're rolling out the hotline and partnering with, when employees are coming to you, or they've submitted their report, you're reaching out to them about it, is having that level of empathy. If you think it's the stupidest thing you've ever heard in your life, with a popcorn example or some petty thing about it, just knowing like how you respond to that is really going to matter. And so just knowing, having that level of empathy is going to be important.
Love that. Maybe Colin, would love to ask you about the employee fears, because I know we talked a lot about the importance of like essentially making employees feel confident that this is an anonymous channel, because often employees maybe like hear that, but in the back of their minds they're like, but is it? Curious like how you've seen or how you have navigated really convincing employees and sort of helping them get over that fear.
Yeah, it's been a while, but we have definitely had issues with this. And I think you'll find this in a lot of the other tools out there, just generally speaking, that although, yes, it's anonymous, like, you can break it up into groups, and you'll find leaders who try to ask, who do you think this is? And where did it come from? And we've even had some cases where someone would take an anonymous comment and, screenshot it and basically like, think that they know who the person is, and then go to that person and say like, I know this is you, like, I
Yeah.
can't believe you posted this or did this. So we had some challenges where we needed to really reset that expectation that no, this is a psychologically safe place. We want to hear from you. We want to have as many places that this can happen, and this is one of them. And so you really need to, you got to show by action, right? So you need to clean up any of the places where you do have managers who might be trying to figure out who said what, right? Like we have an anonymous upward feedback process that just finished at Cloudbeds, and the number one thing that we train on all the managers is you cannot ask who said what. It's completely anonymized. It's completely it's all trends, right? We use AI there's no way you could track it back to the person, but you could if you asked them. And some people would feel obligated to tell you what they said. So that's a big thing that we train on, of like, you're not allowed to ask. You need to just take it. It needs to be a place so that they will actually say it again the next time. And even, yes, if it's a little bit of a lie or an exaggeration or emotionally charged, you want it to come there, not on Glassdoor, right? You want it to come there and not in a legal lawsuit that's coming later because someone never said anything and you don't know about it. And so, yeah, I think that it's really, really important to show by never targeting anyone who's doing it, by making their culture of retaliation is in a sense punished. If someone does retaliate, it's
Yeah.
immediately dealt with and handled. And if you have toxic managers, you slowly move them out of the organization. If they're not willing to change and to learn and to make it a safe place where people do feel like, this won't hurt me in my job. This won't get someone fired. If it's something that really is bad, maybe they should be fired. But generally
Yeah.
speaking, normally that's not the result of a small report.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Ashley, do you have something to build on?
No,
So strong +1ing. Yeah.
no, a verbal thumbs up, but I think
Uh,
addressing that is really
yeah.
important to recognize. It's why, like, saying thank you to people, having a message of thanks to people so they feel welcome, and the non-retaliation are in emphasis, echoing that. And then, so when you get to the point of having the conversations, like as much as you can in the tool, but then also in that first conversation where they're having a human voice again, and they should know who that's going to be, maybe not by name, but general department or structure, but
Yep.
reiterate that and previewing what's to come. And I know we'll talk about what's to come.
Yeah, I think that's what I was kind of taking away, Colin, from what you're saying is like the hard truth is there's probably not one magic silver bullet you can say to the whole team that they're gonna be like, oh, got it, it is anonymous. Like now I have trust. But instead it's going to be built through the ways that you deal with whatever does come through, either the hotline or just like conversations with HRBPs. Like trust is not something that is going to be like this instantaneous thing, but instead it's going to be a bunch of small actions that kind of like lead to people being like, you know what, I raised something to an HRBP and like it was actually dealt with, and like that's how you're going to build trust.
Yeah, you like they need to feel heard as much as possible, right? And it's kind of like just like in marketing, you have to, pitch someone 8 times before they'll probably buy your product or they need to see you. You
Yeah,
probably need to in HR like make sure they feel heard and they see that there's things happening and they like 8 times before they're like, okay, I do trust that this is not going to the black hole where nothing's happening, or it's going to directly to my manager and this person's going to take it out on me. So I do think it's just actions over time. And hopefully you never get to the point where you have to regroup the trust. Hopefully you can start from the beginning with these types of tools so that the trust is always there and you just
yep,
have that environment, like Ashley said, where you have great managers and great leaders and great people who they want to hear all this feedback and they want to make sure to correct anything that's an issue.
the dream.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we'll quickly go over this and then start to do kind of some like role play scenarios, in particular, making sure we talk about like what happens when you get a report, because that's like the kind of crux of all of this. So I'll just kind of quickly just address this, which is I've seen kind of people take various design choices. I think all of them valid just based on what you're optimizing for. You call something a hotline. I typically see that employees sort of assume I basically don't use this unless I'm like in Enron or there's like some really big, capital C concern going on. You call it a speak up line or have a concern, and people feel, oh, okay, this is where I might just say like, hey, I'm not totally sure we, have like pay equity, or something that's like, yeah, it's like problematic, but it's not like accounting fraud. And so I think just remembering that you can have a lot of autonomy in terms of how you position this tool. Same is true about where you publicize it. I've seen like HR leaders put links to the hotline in their email signature block. That kind of signals, I want you to be able to quickly find this. Alternatively, you can, essentially bury it in places where it's like pretty hard to find. And obviously that is signaling something else, which is like, hey, this is here if we absolutely need it, but like, no, I'm not publicizing it, and kind of everything in between. Ashley, Colin, anything to add on kind of the design choices you've seen folks make?
I think be careful internationally, right? There are terms that we might use in the US that makes total sense, but like is way more offensive or way more concerning. And so I think, and also there's obviously language differences just generally. Like if you support multiple languages across your company, you might need to do something that's very bland and generic that when it's translated doesn't sound super offensive, right? Like
Yeah.
shouldn't come out as, oh, this is a harassment line, right? Because that comes out in certain areas, because that's not what it is. It's just sort of a whatever that. So I just say you keep it as clear but as bland as possible. And
Yep.
I mean, I'm a big believer this should be talked about on all hands, but I think that's because I think all companies should be super transparent that we want to hear from you and this is a safe environment and create that. But if the only way you can get it done so that people have it is to bury it, because that's what leadership wants, it's better than not having it at all.
Yes, and that's a great point that I think there's I don't think that bury it is like the ideal state. I think it's just sometimes even convincing leadership like, hey, we aren't going to have this like literally everywhere, is like if it's the only way you can get it through. I've seen people sort of make that choice.
Yeah.
Ashley, you had something? Yeah.
I mean, I think it's, I mean, really to the most extreme that your leadership can comfortably get, I think to the point that you have a CEO on the all hands screenshot walking through what that looks like and showing that as an example. And what I would say to that, to encourage that, is to a CEO that's like, what, why can't we just bury that? Like, just bury it. Like, because if you're in that first category we talked about, of like you're rolling this out because you're being required to by a governmental agency, or you're in the middle of litigation or post litigation, then you're probably going to be looking at 2A here. But
Yeah.
what I would say to a leader is like, what are the things you talk about and you want a high trust environment, these things. Like what that looks like to employees is often at a very basic level. And if you have a CEO that looks there's, and then you explain and, have people explain what happens and educate that way, that is such a signal of a high trust environment. And those are the organizations that likely get less complaints or concerns or whatever you want to call them. And so even screen sharing to give people that level of comfort and giving an example of things that intentionally don't dissuade anybody from using, being like, don't use this for something silly. Like, and even saying that on the flip side of like the example of the popcorn, like if there's somebody's burning popcorn, but you don't know how to say that face to face, there's a lot of options. You can talk to these people and these people, but like if your only option is like, I'm just gonna put it in the hotline, we'd rather get it there than for you to never to say it. And so you have a leader that can speak that way. That's a way that people can start to shift that needle to the, 8 points of touch for HR trust, like Colin is probably trademarking as we're
Can confirm 8 and then someone buys immediately. It's great. Okay, cool. So we're kind of talking now about managers in the hotline, and I'm kind of looking at time. We'll spend a little bit of time here and then kind of send the rest on the, like, you've got a report, sort of how do you deal with it? I've been trying to get to questions as they come in, but definitely put into the Q&A any, questions that we haven't answered yet. I think we got to a lot of the earlier ones. Let's see. Maybe actually as one quick, why is this important? I found this benchmarking from Ethisphere, and essentially the 136 is for every 1 report put through a hotline, 3 get raised to either HR, compliance, legal, someone like that, and 6 go to managers. And so like that's why even if you have a hotline, you should generally assume that your frontline managers are still going to be the ones who are at the receiving end of like, hey, I was at the sales kickoff and something super weird and inappropriate happened, or like, popcorn, any version of this. Let's see, Ashley, you always do such great like sort of role plays and kind of working something out. I think we had been talking in the prep call about like, let's say that I bring to you my manager something that I don't think is that big of a deal. I feel like I hear this all the time, like an employee's like, I don't want you to do anything about it. I just kind of want to share it. I want to get it off my chest or something like that. What do you kind of how do you teach managers how to respond in that moment where an employee is kind of like raising something that might be a pretty big flag, but they're trying to do the like, it's not that big of a deal, don't do anything with it, that sort of scenario?
I love this example because I said, as we were like, have been prepping for this, I, it said to Roxanne and Colin that every organization has a ton of hotlines already. And those are managers and colleagues. Managers, meaning that you have a different responsibility. Again, often once a manager is aware of something, it's the whole organization is deemed to know it. And so with managers, I flip it. And so often what I use is approach of like empathy. So especially if someone's coming to their manager to report something, they may use things like, it's not a big deal. And those are a lot of defense mechanisms because they want to, in case that manager is like, that person, like, that's not like them, or they're probably expecting the manager to either defend that person or brush it aside. And so they want to communicate that in the most like, comfortable way possible. And so as a manager, it's really hearing what's to be said and thinking about it. And a lot of times I think it's thinking, what can I do in the moment? And my kind of option. I say often there's no magic potion of anything someone can say in the moment. But if you flip those two words around, there's a lot of options. And so recognizing that and saying, and I just want to be clear, if one is a thank you, like, oh, it really, like the
Yeah.
thank you cannot be underestimated enough, because there's such a level of fear. And so it's very similar to like when you first see someone, rather than coming in hot with like a business thing or responding, just being like, how are you doing in the morning? The same when someone brings you a concern is, thank you for bringing that to me. And like, I can imagine that might not be the most comfortable to say. And as a manager, your head might be scrambling. Again, I've had these situations in real life and I'm like, God, what am I going to do? But to think, you know what? I know you're saying it's not a big deal, but when I hear these things, a couple things. One is it's one, to me personally, it's if that happened, like that's not okay with me. And so from a personal level, like when I hear things like that, like that really, you know, you may not think that's a big deal, but to me, it feels like it is. Or if you disagree and you're like, but to me, like, I want to do something bad. And to say professionally, you know, my job isn't to just be your buddy and be like, oh my God, that's awful. Like roll my eyes and commiserate. My job is to think about how we take action. And my job isn't alone. And so I want to think on this, and I may reach out to, you know, and identify who you reach out to, because oftentimes if I'm a manager and Colin is my HRBP, I'm going to reach out to Colin and say either I'll get back to you, or Colin may reach out to you directly. And to reiterate, like, this is as confidential as I know it's kept as confidential as possible. Colin can explain what that looks like. I'm just going to talk to Colin. I'm not talking to other people about this, but just to get a sense of what needs to happen, again, because it doesn't sit right. And I appreciate you bringing that up. I'd probably shorten that to about like 30 seconds. But just this aspect of like thanking them, like the empathizing, right size, strip away some of that discomfort, and then letting them know what's going to happen from a communication standpoint, whether it's the popcorn example or whether it's like a very serious concern from like the sales kickoff or other event. Having that same kind of playbook can help managers at least communicate the basics, and then the path will go where it will go.
I like that because it's in between correctly in between these two extremes of like an ostrich as a manager being like, oh well, it's not a big deal, it's not a big deal. Like, so, you know, where's my blog post? Like, you know, just kind of pretending they didn't hear it. And then on the flip side, becoming like a vigilante and saying like, oh, okay, I'm gonna go,
say
you know,
something. Like, yeah, I'm gonna take that
like,
is like that.
yeah.
Hey, blood, I'll just keep it PG-ish.
Yeah,
You know, that is, he can't say that to you. I will deal with it. And then, and like, because also, you know, you never know, you know, what's going to happen. And so you're not promising an outcome. You're also not avoiding it.
Yep. I think that that sounds like it sounds like we're saying is like, make sure you're kind of training managers, even in an informal kind of like, doesn't need to be this like massive training campaign, but like make sure that managers are equipped to have done some role plays, you know, prep themselves a little bit for that moment of it's not a big deal, but, you know, or just like, hey, something weird happened, you know, that kind of a thing. Cause like those are reports, they just are like masquerading as, you know, like small things.
Yeah. And I use, and what I talk about, which is more of like some of the soft skills and things, it's the same thing I say to HR, but that ed level of empathy. When you're a manager, you're probably not going to get the complaint when you're just sitting there, like looking out the window, hoping for you. You're going to get it when you're stressed and you have a million things going on. But to managers, to say like just flipping it and how important it is in that moment for you to be able, again, you don't have to take the time to go investigate that, pull things away, but just taking a pause and showing that level of empathy. How you respond can matter greatly about how long they decide to stay at your organization, what they do about it.
Yeah.
You know, so many things. And so managers have a lot more powers than they realize.
Well, I think your point on like how you can respond really matters is like the perfect kind of last topic to end on, because you all definitely blew my mind a little bit in terms of some of the really clever ways that we talked about in the prep call of like, what can you do when you have received a report, you have investigated it, you've taken action, and of course you can't go back to, in this fictitious example, Roxanne, and say like, well, Roxanne, guess what? Took this, then this action, and here's what we found, and Joe got fired, and you know, like there's a bunch of things you're probably going to need to be keeping confidential. But that doesn't also mean that you can that you have to be completely silent. I would love for you all to talk, and maybe Colin, starting with you, like what have you seen be really effective in terms of things you can tell to someone who has raised an issue, they've identified who it is, so you know who it is. You talked about, I think before, like visible and invisible consequences. Just would love you to like educate us on what your options are, even when you're maintaining confidentiality.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the biggest, I think number one important piece is like it's kind of along Ashley's, like, you need to say thank you. You need to make sure that they know you got it. They know you're looking into it. You need to follow up when you
Yeah.
have figured out what's going on, and you need to be able to share something, right? It doesn't mean that you're, so, it totally depends on the type of report, but there are times where there's visible consequences, meaning someone has been let go, or there's a policy that's been changed, or like it's visible to everyone that, okay, yeah, there's things being done here based on maybe my feedback, maybe other people's feedback. But then I think, and I think Priscilla is one of my team members is on the call, and she can comment on this. But like, one of the most frustrating things for HR is that there's a lot of invisible things that we do that we can't share, that no one knows that's happening, that we don't get the credit for, right? It's sort of one of those things where, like, you can't share that you're doing all these things behind the scenes, because
Yeah.
if you shared it, it would compromise the safety of that situation, or it would compromise some type of business unit, or would put you liable, whatever the case may be. And so you kind of have to share as much as you can with that person who reported it, and also with the company, without giving anything away that undermines the whole point of this, which is,
Yeah.
you need to have a safe place to come. We will heavily investigate it. If it's real and there's a pattern here, we'll make moves and make changes. If it's not fully real, or maybe you just were really frustrated, because a friend of yours was let go and you just don't like that they were let go, and we investigate and there's nothing really there, then we're more likely not going to do much. But we are going to sort of make sure they know that we looked into it, and we are adjusting things. And a lot of times, a little minor policy updates to help make it a little bit more clear next time, or better communication, or a way to handle work trips if there was something that happened.
Yeah.
It's usually good enough, and most people understand that you can't share everything.
I think when we talked in the prep call, you had shared how much I appreciate the pilots when you're stuck, and haven't taken off yet, who just are giving like a 10-minute update every 10 minutes, even if the update is like no update. I think even that, in this type of scenario, so like in the scenario of like I bring something to Ashley and I say it's like not that big of a deal, just like coming back and saying like, hey, just wanted to circle back. It's still on my plate. I'm having conversations, no update yet, can really mean a lot, because I'm like, okay, at least you like said something. I'm not assuming, I'm not almost like spinning in my head of like, where did my report go? And like, does nobody care about me? I think like that void can be dangerous.
Also, I think
Yeah.
scarier is that people are like, I just sent this off and I don't know what that means for my career or me, or like,
Yeah. Yeah.
so you have to tell them that they are safe. This is good. Thank you for, like, because, you go through the weekend thinking that you might be fired on Monday because you submitted something that, is not, not acceptable, right, in the sense, or that, that person's protected, or whatever the case may be. You've got to
Yeah.
be, they need to know that this was a good thing, and you're on it, and they're going to be safe. Like, there's not going to be any type of retaliation from this, even if they're
Yeah.
wrong, or it's not a real complaint.
Ashley, how about for you? Like, what are kind of options that you can share to the whole company, right? So like even probably more limited, right? Because you're like trying to communicate this to the whole org. If maybe yeah, you've received an issue, you're taking some sort of action. Like, what are your options?
I mean, I think it's one is, I think, to the point at the outset, the first conversation someone has with that HR investigator, whoever, to paint like this is what's going to happen again. At the end of the day, there's going to be outcomes. Some may be visible, some may be invisible. So like, so then when that comes around and you have the same kind of conversation, things, if you're at a point where someone has been terminated from employment, especially someone in a leadership position, and everybody in the whole company organization knows what happened, and they're just waiting for you to give this blessing of like, we wish them well in their future thing. Having been lawyer me, most places in the US, I would have been comfortable saying like, no, we let them go as a result of this organization. And we ended that. Again, that's where you got to be careful with the legalities. But often people are like, we can't share private information.
Yeah.
And response isn't always there's like a legal thing. People might do it and they may not want to. But if everybody in the organization does, then taking that stand sometimes is saying that you did that. And so that is absolutely an option. And to me, it's as long as you can do it legally, there's no constraints. It's a far better option than this of like, we're keeping details confidential, or, things like that. Like the awkward thing where everyone's side texting or slacking to themselves and being like, God, these leaders, like they just, boy, I'd love to be a leader one day. And, even when you get fired, nobody will nobody will happen. And so, because
Yeah.
in addition to HBR, I do very scientific studies of like the comment sections of social media. And I can tell you, like, the
God
number
help
one is
you.
people that are like, I reported this, nobody ever got back to me, or nothing, nothing ever happens from these. And I have, from very personal experience, I know all too well, including the most senior of leaders, things do happen to them. And so when you can give those examples, I think it's important, and I think consequences merit that where you can.
I think that's a great point. There's I feel like legal situations are always tricky. It's sort of a risk judgment decision, but I feel like sometimes leaders forget that like things are going to be happening regardless, right? Like rumors, conversations. Like I think there can be this false idea in leadership positions that you can entirely control the narrative, and almost like remembering that people are human and they're going to have a story unless you share with them, your perspective. Like I think when that's like available, that's really powerful.
Yeah. And
Sharing that, like, yeah.
I know we're on the short, but like talking about like sometimes like an apology, for example. Well, generally there's not going to be a situation where you'd have an apology to the whole company.
Yeah.
Part of it, as well as that different relationship with that reporter, the person that raised that concern, is getting a sense of their comfort. Like sometimes they welcome that apology. Sometimes like, I want nothing to do with them. And again, if it's a pretty serious consequence, it's always important to think about if you're keeping that person that was accused or the subject of the report. If you are, just making sure the reporter is comfortable with things. They may not want any communication in the future, and they may still really hold it against that person gets to keep their job, but so keeping their comfort in mind as well. Like an apology isn't always appropriate or welcome across the board, or at least a verbal.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally right. All right, I want to make sure we get everyone out on time. Ace is gonna be sharing a quick survey, and while they do that, huge thank you, Ashley and Colin. I think this is like such valuable, really tactical, sort of specific information. We'll be sending out some resources afterwards, including some of the like blog posts on all of the like why you got to have these sorts of things in case those are helpful. And then you can find all of us on LinkedIn. But yeah, just huge thank you, Ashley and Colin, for kind of sharing your brains and your experience and your fun facts, which were indeed very fun. Any parting words, Ashley, Colin?
I was just going to answer Joy's question of
Mhm.
like when it happens when an employee reports a theft to another employee, is that considered a report?
Yeah,
I
please.
think
Sorry, I
one
didn't
thing,
catch that one.
I think one thing to be noted too is that even when you have a bunch of people who are out for drinks, but they were there because of a business event, that's still considered business. And so there's a lot that happens when drinks flow and you're at conferences or you're at different things. And so all of those definitely count. If there was a theft, like someone took, the shopping cart home at the grocery store and you saw it was an employee, maybe that's not something the company can do something about. But generally speaking, I think these hotlines are pretty open-ended, because if you do see something that happened or that you think is like, at least allow the company to investigate and see if there's something really there. So I think most things would fall under that for sure.
Great call out.
Yeah.
Ashley, any parting words?
My last is, I'll answer, I think, an anonymous feedback, which is what do you do if people are using like AI to generate buzzwords in the hotline? Or the kind of flip to that sometimes of like, what if someone seems coached by a plaintiff's lawyer? I personally have treated every concern. I assume everybody always has a plaintiff's lawyer, and I wouldn't treat anyone differently if they're getting that type of resource and that's their outlet. And I'm glad that at least it's a conversation while they're still at the organization or within the hotline. And if someone's using AI, I think for that, because people don't know how to say things sometimes, like they're like, how would I say this? And so that's why, as you're going through an investigation, part of it that's so important is to make sure your team, if someone's like, I was harassed, this explaining, like, I know it's super uncomfortable to talk about what happened, but it is important for us to really get a sense of what happened, and really only making them kind of tell their story once. But so just knowing people may use AI because they don't know how else to do it.
And we
It's an
also,
amazing note of empathy.
to that
Yeah.
point, we have corrected many people who've used the wrong word to describe what happened to them, because a lot of people will go immediately to harassment or to because they don't know any better. And a lot of times it's not that. It's bad working styles or an offensive comment, but it's not necessarily like, we try to let them know that it's really serious if you use certain words. So like if this isn't that serious, like the words you use matter.
Colin, amazing plug for Ethena. We either have or just had a webinar on exactly this topic of essentially what happens when employees are using words that like harassment, discrimination, when understandably they don't always know the sort of strict definition of that. So we can definitely make sure to circulate that too, because it's very related, I think, to some of the
Sweet.
topics we were discussing today.
Send an invoice, no problem.
Are you our marketing team? You hit those 8 moments. Yeah. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you so much, folks, for joining us today. And Ashley and Colin, it was just an absolute delight. I hope everyone has a great rest of their week.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
For having us.
Bye.